views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of the Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So, hello and welcome to a very special episode we are recording today. I have with me Professor Pant, Vice President, Studies in Foreign Policy at Observer Research Foundation, and Professor of International Relations with King's Institute at King's College London. So thank you so much, Professor, for taking your time and speaking to us.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Ratnadeep.
So the recently concluded 15 BRICS Summit gathered attention for its discussion on de-dollarization, the Ukraine war, and the expansion of the bloc. So what are your key takeaways from the summit, particularly in terms of the issues that have been discussed?
See, it was a very interesting summit, but I think the more interesting stuff happened outside the summit. When Mr. Putin was addressing his counterparts, we got the news that Prigozhin is dead. And then when Mr. Modi was about to do that, we got the news that India has landed and the Chandrayaan has landed on the moon. So I think it in some ways signifies very different trajectories that countries within the BRICS platform are taking and where they are going, what their aspirations are in global politics, how they want to play their roles. Russia's role as a disruptor in chief is quite out in the open. India balancing, its relations with the West and looking at the future as a key node in itself, I think tells you that story. So within BRICS, the old optimism which was framed around BRICS as a platform where you have 5 emerging economies, that no longer exists. Out of the 5, I think only India is supposedly doing well economically. Even China is at the moment in deep economic distress. And of course, Russia, we know, is marginalized, and South Africa and Brazil are also, almost very, very weak economically. So I think the challenge is primarily how do you think of BRICS as a platform, because it has become very disparate organization with 5 disparate countries, Russia and China presumably on one side, and the others perhaps somewhere in Brazil and South Africa somewhere in between. India also taking a very, very distinct stand on certain issues. And now I think this summit in particular was all about expansion. We knew from the beginning that expansion is on the cards because it had been approved last year. But we also knew that there were differences among countries on how to proceed. So I would say the big takeaway has been that expansion has happened this year. The other takeaway perhaps is that some of these countries want to move ahead on trading in local currencies. I think that was a big buzz around that issue. But the fact that you have 40-odd countries wanting to join BRICS also tells you a story about the present-day global order, where I think there is a lot of dissatisfaction with West's approach on global issues, and a lot of the developing countries are looking for alternatives. But I would say that this summit will perhaps be remembered more for Chandrayaan and Prigozhin. If 10 years down the line, when you look back at this summit, you would look at it and say that, look, this was perhaps the summit where the expansion started, but also the BRICS as such lost their identity, because if you have a platform that is known from its 5 members, and now you have a cricket team there of 11 members, then I think the question is, what does it represent? What do they want to do with by coming together? BRICS, for all its challenges, has a certain cohesion. Now it's with 11 countries. What's the sense of purpose out there? It's not entirely clear.
And in fact, that was my next question, actually, about the expansion of BRICS to include new members. And it has been a focal point of discussion even in the last summit as well. And you mentioned in your article that China's push for a quick expansion of BRICS to give it an anti-Western orientation has been even met with resistance from India and Brazil. Could you explain the motivation behind this resistance and potential implications for the bloc's direction? Is it more to do with China's pursuit of its own economic goals and strategies?
See, that as far as India is concerned, I think all the moves of China are looked at with suspicion. So I don't think there is any big mystery there. But certainly when you talk of expansion of a platform that has to fundamentally reach a consensus on amongst the 5 member states, that's a challenge, because when you don't have trust even within the 5 members, then the question of expansion provokes this question as to what is the purpose behind this expansion. And China has been very aggressively pushing it. It was not simply a question of, in principle agreeing for expansion, but if you see the last 1 year, China has been very aggressive, and perhaps also pointing out, to many of these countries who had applied, 40 odd countries, we were told, had applied for induction. China was also painting India as the villain. That, look, we are all for expansion, but India perhaps does not want any expansion. So I think the challenge for India was becoming stark. That, look, if India doesn't agree to expansion, that India could be easily said to have been the one stumbling block. Now, India, I think what has been able to do in this summit is to perhaps moderate the expansion process. That, look, all the countries that were admitted, they all have good ties with India. Whether it is UAE, Saudis, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia. So in some ways, India has been able to, at least for a while, block this Chinese move to create this platform and give this platform an anti-West orientation. Now, if you see what Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping spoke at this summit, a large part of their arguments were aimed at the West. So this platform is becoming less of what BRICS can do for the world than how this platform can push against what perhaps in particular China and Russia see as West's designed to contain them. And therein lies the challenge for BRICS. What started off as a geo-economic enterprise is morphing into something which looks like a geopolitical enterprise. And there India will have very strong reservations on how this pans out. So I think while China's motivations are pretty clear in terms of bringing in other actors and also making this more aggressively anti-West platform, I think India's role is going to be even more critical going forward. And therein, I think, lies a lot of challenges. Lie a lot of challenges for India.
And as you rightly mentioned, that India does emerge a certain kind of a winner from this expansion even as well, because what China would have wanted an anti-West agenda, most of these members, even some of them are Indian top partners, Egypt, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and UAE. And most of them are important in the Middle East key targets of engagement as well. So I wanted to know that. And the other thing I wanted to know about the principles that India mentioned, that there should be an agreement before this expansion happens. So were them in agreement before this expansion took place?
See, I think behind the scenes, certainly there would have been some agreement on certain principles that that would need to be agreed upon before any expansion takes place, because Indian Prime Minister's statement also categorically said that India is in favor of expansion, but with consensus and with clear guidelines. So in some ways, those guidelines, those parameters, that criteria would have to be agreed upon before you allow certain countries in. And I think there again, India would have ensured, or India seems to have ensured, that China's ability to put its own friends, and especially those that are dependent on China for BRI, has been somewhat moderated. Now, all of these countries, as you are pointing out, have good ties with India, but they also have good ties with China. And I think that's where the consensus would have come. That, look, these are the countries on which every country, 5 members would have agreed upon. The question is, going forward, as further rounds of expansion will happen, how will this process be moderated? What kind of specific criteria? What kind of specific criteria is developed? What kind of parameters are developed? What kind of principles are agreed upon? We don't know publicly what those criteria, that criteria is at the moment. But I'm certain that this would have taken a big chunk of that agreement. But remember, India would have been in a bind if India would have prevented this expansion from going forward, because it would have been very easy to paint India as the villain of the piece. So I think India has prevented that from happening. India has also ensured that certain kinds of actors enter into BRICS, but it's a long way off. I think this challenge and this fundamental fault line between India and China, and between Russia, India on one side, and the others on the on the other, to frame it as a anti-West platform, that struggle within the BRICS is only going to get starker by the day.
And this is actually, I wanted to bring your attention because you mentioned in the article as well that the idea of a larger BRICS grouping potentially struggles with a lack of coherence. So how might this challenge be addressed, especially considering the already complex dynamics within the current member states?
I really don't have any answer to it. I think, it seems to me that the intention, if the present trends continue, if you keep on adding countries, like if you say 40 odd countries have applied, then next year you will say 80 odd countries have applied, then what is the difference behind this platform and G77, or say non-aligned movement eventually? I mean, what is it that you are trying to make of this? That question has not been answered. And to be honest, this question was never answered from the very beginning, except that when BRICS started, it was clear that these are 5 emerging economies that want to have greater say in global economic management. Now, that fundamental assumption today stands shattered because it's not entirely clear beyond just coming together every year. What has been the accomplishment of BRICS apart from New Development Bank? If you look at the summits per se, you do not see any significant accomplishment. And in fact, the challenges only have mounted. The India-China challenge, the Russia-China and the others challenge, those challenges have been mounted, have been growing, in recent years, precisely because of different foreign policy trajectories of these countries. So it seems to me that going forward, we are only going to see more and more of these challenges becoming very, very explicit rather than implicit. And while this time we have seen this expansion happening with certain degree of consensus, next time we will see another number of countries coming in with their challenges, and with India and China, or Russia, China on one side taking very different positions on these matters. But ultimately, I think BRICS as a platform will have to first decide what is it that they want to do with this platform, because as of now there are so many assumptions, but no real concrete action on the ground. And if you read the stories, media stories about BRICS across the world, you will see different interpretations. Some people are saying, oh, can this be an anti-Western bloc? Can this stand up to West? Can this be a response to even NATO? Some people are talking about response to IMF and World Bank. I think there is so much lack of clarity on this that I very much doubt if this is not a reflection of the lack of clarity that perhaps the nations themselves have about this platform.
And is there actually a need to have something like a BRICS with an expansion when China already has an SCO with it? Does it need another expansion organization? And I want to move and ask a little bit on that, because how is even BRICS adapting to the changing power realities? Is it keeping in mind of the power dynamics that are changing?
See, it is very important for any platform or any institution to adapt to the changing power realities and keep itself relevant. Otherwise, what happens is that if you see the history of international relations, you would observe that institutions rarely die. You will not find very many institutions that have disappeared. They simply become irrelevant because they don't reflect the power realities. So the challenge again for BRICS is that if you do not adapt to contemporary power realities, and the power realities are very, very clear. The reality is, and this is again, I go back to the point that I made at the very first instance when we started this conversation, that you have a Russia that is, under Putin, the biggest story about Russia is that it is boiled down in a war that it killed Prigozhin. And the story about India is that you have India rising in the global power hierarchy. India is, setting its foot on the moon as the first nation to be on the South Pole. So you can see the divergence in terms of the trajectories of these two nations. That one is looking backwards, one is looking forwards, one is a rising power, one is a declining power. And I think that challenge itself reflects on the relevance of BRICS. That what does it mean for BRICS when you have this kind of disparity happening within BRICS, and when the fundamental fault line of China and India hasn't been resolved. So when India started this BRICS project, it was very clear that China was a dominant player, but India also was very sure of Russia's support in managing China. Today, you have Russians and the Chinese in one camp, basically trying to take BRICS in a very anti-West orientation. So in that context, it's very difficult to see how this BRICS can ever be relevant if you don't take into account present day realities, if you don't sort out India-China equation, if you don't sort out the West versus anti-West orientation of their members. What you can do is you can still keep it relevant, you can make it relevant, but you have to go to the first principle. You have to see that, look, we were very disparate countries to begin with, but we decided to focus on raising the world's attention on the global economic problems and the lack of decision making in global economic platforms. Therefore, we created this. But today, the ambition has become to convert it into something which it was never intended to do. It was never intended to be a geopolitical platform. But today we are making it into a geopolitical platform. So I think the questions that all five countries will have to ask is what to do with BRICS as a platform and how far we can take it as a genuine platform that really can genuinely contribute to global stability.
I was even more shocked actually to look at some of the articles which spoke about that not much have been spoken on the war in Ukraine. But when we have five countries out of which two has already abstained and two vetoes it out, is there even any point to talk about the war on Ukraine actually in a summit like BRICS?
I don't think so. See, it works by consensus. So you have Russia, which is one of the parties to the conflict. So how can you talk about Ukraine on such a platform? The reality is that India and China are increasingly uncomfortable with that war continuing, but their ability to do something about it vis-a-vis Russia is fairly limited. So, and I don't think China wants to do that. China is, it might feel that it is gaining some advantages out of it, with Russia being completely dependent on China and the West also trying to, take some help from China to, if at all China can mediate it. So I think I don't see any big, role for BRICS in that conflict. In any case, it was never meant to resolve peace and security issues.
So my last question is, I will ask a little bit about India actually. That how does India actually have a larger role to play in BRICS? We have seen India has invested in the BRICS platform while actually maintaining bilateral and plurilateral partnership with the Western Bloc as well. But how do you see this India Strategic Balancing Act shaping its role within the BRICS, and what does the future of BRICS hold actually? Does the BRICS have any future?
See, I personally, I have never been a BRICS optimist from the very beginning. I've always believed that there is a fallacy around BRICS that will continue to shape the trajectory of this platform. But I think from India's perspective, when India started this project with other members, the logic was very clear that India wanted, as a rising economic power, its voice to be heard on global economic platforms, on global restructuring, and to a certain extent, India could leverage the space that this platform provided India, because China was present, Russia was present, and others were present. So it could leverage that. But today things are completely different, because Russia is no longer as supportive of India's desire to play that kind of a role, and Russia's relationship with China continues to constrain Russia's options and India's options. And of course, as we know, that Russia is no longer is in a position to talk about economy, because Russia's economy is in doldrums. So, the whole question that India has to ask is how much to invest in BRICS as a platform, and to what extent can India believe that its investment will pay off. see, in our lives, we all invest in projects where you have certain sunk costs. Now, I think for India to have a leg at this table is important, because you want that engagement with the large part of the developing world to continue. But what are going to be substantive outcomes from this? I think that is becoming less and less sure, that is becoming less and less evident to me. And I'm sure as we move forward with more powers entering into BRICS, with more countries entering into BRICS, the future of BRICS would be very, I think, in some ways, very unpredictable. And I would say that for India, the concrete outcomes from BRICS would always be fairly limited compared to, say, the outcomes that it might expect from other platforms, where there are some concrete objectives that one is seeking. But in BRICS, what are those concrete objectives that is becoming increasingly less clear?
Well, that's all I had to ask you. Thank you so much, Professor, for taking your time and speaking to us.
Thank you, Ratnadeep. Thank you.